What we're going to do now is we're going to first hear from Jessica Peters of our Legislative Analyst Office on where the current funding grows. She's going to go over that briefly, and then we have what our options are from various perspective of local, state, other individuals. We have Brian still here. Brian's listed. Jessica Peters from the Legislative Analyst. Others are here, so we'll begin with Jessica, and welcome, Jessica. She's from the LAO office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. There was a handout just passed out to you. This provides an overview of state funding for highways and roads, and this you can think of, yes, this is a sort of a background document for you in terms of where the existing funding sources come from. We'll also have a second handout for you for the next part of the discussion on options, but I'm going to go through the overview handout first, really briefly. I'm trying to be aware of your time here. Page 1 of the handout, we lay out for you a description of each of the state's 4 major highway and road programs. There's 2 programs operated by Caltrans, the Highway Maintenance Program, which performs sort of routine maintenance, litter removal, graffiti removal, those types of things, as well as some more minor maintenance projects. There's a budget of about $1.4 billion for the maintenance program, with about $200 million of that for maintenance projects. The state's sort of more robust reconstruction, rehabilitation program, when highways have really more significantly fallen into a state of disrepair, they may be fixed through the State Highway Operation and Protection Program, or SHOP program, that Secretary Kelly mentioned earlier in his comments. The state will allocate Caltrans will allocate about $2.3 billion to this program in the 15-16 budget year, with a large share of these funds coming from the federal government. The state also has a State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, which was sort of traditionally the state's program for expanding capacity of transportation systems. This can fund a variety of projects: state highways, local roads, intercity rail, or transit. Funding allocated to the STIP for the budget for I guess now the current year, now that July 1 is here, would be $300 million for the STIP. And then lastly, the state has a program to share some of its revenues with cities and counties for their systems that they own, their local streets and roads, and that amounts to $1.4 billion for 15-16. I'll quickly go through sort of the makeup of where these monies come from. Page 2 of the handout, there's a pie chart that sort of lays out where the state revenues come from. You can see in the chart that about 3/4 of all of the state's money, which amounts to about $5.6 billion in total for highways and roads, 3/4 of that comes from excise taxes on gasoline. And then there's another share that comes from the excise tax on diesel, as well as some funding from vehicle weight fees. Page 3 of the handout, we have the gasoline pump figure that I think you all have seen before. Looking at the figure, the state has 2 excise taxes that it charges on gasoline: a variable tax that's currently set at 12 cents and a base tax at the rate of 18 cents. There's also, in terms of from the motorist perspective, they're paying a federal excise tax as well when they're at the pump, and there may be other state or local statewide taxes that they pay as well. Those federal funds they come back to the state in the form of the Federal Surface Transportation Program, and so we're not going to walk through the allocation of those here. The base 18 cents is expected to generate about $2.5 billion out of that total $5.6 billion, and the variable 12-cent rate is expected to generate about $1.7 billion for the 15-16 year. If you turn to page 4 of the handout, this explains the uses of those gasoline excise tax revenues. So from the base 18 cents, 2/3 of the revenues are deposited into the state highway account, and this funds a variety of things, including Caltrans administration, the highway maintenance program, as well as funding for the SHOP program. 1/3 of these funds are allocated to cities and counties for their local streets and roads. That's the local streets and roads program that I discussed on the first page. That amounts to about $800 million for the 15-16 year. The variable excise tax is distributed under a different formula, and the figure at the bottom of the page explains that formula. It's a little bit more complex. Essentially, of all of the revenues under that tax, again, estimated at, I think we said 1.7 billion, the sort of off the top comes this portion that goes to backfill for weight fees, which are used to pay for debt service on general obligation bonds that fund transportation, which I'll talk about in a minute. But those monies come off the top, and so you can think of that as about $1 billion off the top. The remaining funds are split on a formula, 44% to cities and counties for their local streets and roads, 44% to the STIP, and 12% to the SHOP. And just to give you a sense, for the 15-16 year, that 44% to cities and counties and to SHOP is about $308 million respectively. It's gone down in recent years. Page 5 of the handout explains diesel taxes. So the state has several taxes on diesel fuel. There's sales taxes that are dedicated to transit, and so I'm not going to go into detail on those, but you can see them displayed there on the figure. And the state also has an excise tax on diesel fuel, and that is used for highways and roads. The rate is variable and is set at the rate of 13 cents for the 15-16 year, and that's expected to generate about $440 million. These revenues are deposited, well, 6 cents, the first revenues associated with the first 6 cents go to cities and counties, and then the remainder of the funds go to the state highway account for Caltrans administration, the highway maintenance program, and the SHOP. Similar to the base gasoline tax, just with a different rate amounts. And then on the last 2 pages of the handout, we have some background information for you on weight fees, which is the last revenue source that we're going to discuss that the state has for highways and roads. The state charges weight fees, which are essentially registration fees charged to heavy vehicles like commercial trucks for their travel on the state's roadways. These revenues generate about $1 billion a year. And as you can see in the figure, the total bar represents the total amount of revenues, and it also shows how these revenues have been used. The dark shaded area on the bar shows the portion of these revenues that have gone to offset transportation debt service costs paid by the general fund, and the light shaded portion of the bar represents loans that have been made to the general fund. And so essentially all of these weight fee revenues are going to benefit the general fund in one way or another. In the years when the amount of eligible debt service that can be paid from weight fees is less, you see the remainder is loaned. In future years, if the amount of eligible debt service is greater than the amount of weight fee revenues, these loans will actually be repaid, but when they're repaid, they will be used to pay that future debt service. And so when you're thinking about the repayment of these loans under current law, these dollars will go to benefit the general fund by essentially offsetting future debt service costs. Under the current structure, they wouldn't be repaid to transportation for additional projects, for example, but rather to pay for the financing of those past projects. And we just have some more detail of that on page 7. I'm happy to take questions on just sort of background on transportation funding, if there are any, or we can quickly walk you through this second handout on options for the legislature to consider. It's a shorter handout.
I actually do.
Senator Berryhill has a question. Senator
Yeah, I
Berryhill.
do. Just as kind of for purposes of this discussion, back in the day, we had the GOP 5. We talked about a spending cap and paying down $33 billion in debt that we had borrowed over the years, and that was a staggering figure that for me at the time. And so I guess my question is, we've got these gas excise tax, we have taxes on diesel, and it's fine that 2/3 of it goes to highway maintenance, but over the years, how much of that money has actually made it to the roads, and how much of that money over the years has been borrowed? I realize some of it's been paid back at times, but but how much of that money have we deferred over the years? And again, I'm asking this question because, again, this goes back to the credibility issue as we look forward to asking for more revenues for the same. So who's to keep us from doing the same thing over and over again?
Sure. If we're happy to follow up with you if you have a specific time frame in terms of looking at the amount of loans that were taken and repaid. I can say that as of right now, there are about $900 million in outstanding transportation loans from non-late fee revenues that, when they are repaid to transportation accounts, would fund projects. There's also about $1.4 billion in outstanding late fee loans, which under current statute, when they're repaid, would just sort of cycle back and be used to pay, offset those future debt service costs. And so under the current structure, you wouldn't really think about those funding new projects. In terms of all the pluses and minuses over the years of loans that have been taken and repaid, happy to follow up with you on more detail.
I'd appreciate if you would, because again, the credibility factor to the people that I'm going to go to, it's that very money that they'll say, well, if we would have been spending that money on roads all along, maybe we wouldn't have quite the problem and the amount of depth of problem that we've got today, had we had that money actually not been borrowed and actually had been put to what we said it was going to. So something, yeah, I'd appreciate if you'd follow up on that. Thank you.
I want to ask you a question. Under Proposition 2, we created these reserves, right? Do the reserves have to pay back these loans, or can we use those reserves to pay back the loans?
So I'm not the LAO's Prop 2 expert, but my limited understanding is that some of the funding available in Prop 2 is for paying down debt.
That's what I thought. So can you get back to our committee on that? And Senator Bearhill's question, because I believe they can be used for that. But I don't know. I'm not the expert. I'm just a...
Mr. Chair, did you have we'll follow up with your staff on sort of specific information.
Yeah, you can talk to the committee staff and give us maybe information. Why don't we go into the options part of this, looking at options. So Jessica, you got a report. You want to go through that?
Sure. So this would be...
LAO has this report entitled Options for Addressing the State's Transportation Needs. And we'll go through that and, as an overview, and then invite the other speakers to comment.
Great. So this would be the second handout that I think was just passed out, looking very similar to the first one on the cover, but entitled Options for Addressing State Transportation Needs. So here we just lay out, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just some ideas for the legislature in terms of various ways to address transportation needs. In the beginning of the handout, we have information on potential ways to increase funding for transportation. That's obviously a focus of the special session in this committee, as well as some information on improving efficiency and effectiveness, which can also help meet needs. Page 1 of the handout, I'll draw your attention to a table in the middle of the page. One of the options that the legislature has is to increase existing fees or taxes that the state charges on fuels or vehicles, which, as we just showed in our other presentation, is the primary way that the state funds transportation. And so in this figure, we just list several of the more common sources or the ones that have been used in the past to fund transportation, or the ones that members are talking about or interested in potentially for funding transportation. The gasoline excise tax, diesel excise tax could both be raised. We provide in here what the allowable uses are and a sense of how much per penny increase that might generate, and that can kind of help give a sense of how much of an increase might be needed to meet the needs. Just as an example, I think it was a question that came up earlier. Someone asked for the local needs of $7.8 billion a year. What would that mean in terms of a revenue increase? If you were to increase just the gasoline tax as an example, that would be roughly 52 cents a gallon increase to generate that amount of revenue. And so there's some information there that can kind of help sort of give a sense of what different revenue sources are going to generate for you. On the second page of the handout, we have other options for increasing funding for transportation. You could charge new taxes or fees aside from the ones that the state currently charges. There was recent legislation last year to do a feasibility study on a road usage charge, which, Mr. Chairman, you're familiar with. And
The chair of our committee in a minute, he's going to.
And so considering things like that, maybe over the longer term are an option. The state also used to charge a sales tax on gasoline. And if the state were to do that again, those funds would be required under provisions in the Constitution to be dedicated to transportation. The state could use other existing state revenues, including money from the general fund or potentially allocating additional cap and trade auction revenues to meet transportation needs in a manner that's consistent with the requirements of the use of the cap and trade funds. And then lastly, the state could repay outstanding transportation loans. This is the 900 million figure that I referenced earlier. And then in addition, there's that 1.4 billion of late fees that if you wanted that to fund new projects would require a statutory change is currently dedicated to.
If we did that, we'd have to pay the bonds from some other way, right?
That's correct. These funds are currently dedicated towards paying off sort of the financing of past transportation projects. And so.
How would the bonds be paid then? Their obligations, general obligations?
Correct. So currently, yes, it would come from the general fund. It currently ineligible portions of the debt service, or if the debt service is higher than the amount of late fees, that comes from the general fund.
And all the bonds are prescribed, they're already sold, all the 100% of them? No?
I don't believe many of them have been sold. I don't believe they've all been sold.
Some haven't been sold?
If we,
That information.
Mr. Chairman, I know many of the dollars have been programmed out of 1B, but I'm not sure every bond has been
Okay, so we could,
sold and issued. So there,
bonds that haven't been sold, we can do some different.
well, except that the dollars from them have been programmed.
Yeah, the dollars have been programmed, but I'm talking about the actual bonds themselves, yeah. Okay. All right.
and then, Mr. Chair, briefly, if you'd like, I can walk through page 3 of the handout, which is the
Please.
efficiency and effectiveness options. So another way of increasing funding for transportation is to run our transportation programs more effectively or more efficiently. And so we have 3 broad concepts here that the legislature may want to consider. We're happy to delve into more details or answer questions or work with you and your staff if you have specific ideas related to any of these. The first one would be to ensure that funds are allocated to the most cost-effective projects. I believe Secretary Kelly handed out something earlier looking at the effects of not properly doing maintenance on our state highways. One of the things that you may want to consider is to fully fund maintenance, even potentially before funding the significant backlog of shop needs. One of the reasons that the state has such great needs for repairing and reconstructing its highways is because we haven't always done the best job in the past of maintaining them. And so bringing the maintenance program up to a state of best practices could help offset some of those future costs as well and be more cost effective. In addition, the legislature may want to think about new funding or even the existing funding, changing the way that it's allocated and considering, rather than the formulas that we had discussed previously, maybe considering creating a more competitive program to ensure that projects are being well prioritized and that the projects that meet the greatest needs are the ones that are being funded. Second, we would recommend requiring project-level accountability. I think Secretary Kelly spoke to sort of broad, overarching performance metrics. We think that you may want to have a little bit more specified accountability down to the project level to ensure that projects are being delivered within their plan, cost, scope, and schedule. This is how many other state projects have that type of accountability and have that type of oversight. And in local government, you have that as well. For transportation projects, the SHOP in particular, as an example, really lacks that type of project level accountability. One option could be to have the Transportation Commission provide that type of accountability to ensure that projects are really being delivered in accordance with what was initially promised and holding Caltrans or local partners accountable. And lastly, we think that the legislature could take steps to ensure that project delivery is being improved. One example could be the Caltrans Capital Lease Support Program that was mentioned earlier. Legislature want to make sure this is operating efficiently. And this could include both the overall size of the program and level of resources, as well as the mix of state staff and private consultants. And the legislature may also want to consider whether having local agencies take a greater role in the delivery of projects would make sense.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I think these are all good ideas and worthy of discussion. So we want to hear from Brian on the subject specifically of options and what kind of options are you
Are you asking me to react to the
Yes.
presentation?
well, react, but also initiate other discussions, other options that you think we ought to explore in our
Well, I guess one thing I would just observe that's not necessarily in the LAO presentation, which is an idea that we think has some merit and worthy of some further review, is an idea presented by the speaker earlier in the year, which suggested perhaps a proxy for a use fee on the transportation system is a sort of vehicle fee that folks would pay once a year, that revenues from which would be dedicated to transportation and highway improvement. We think that's worthy of exploration. I know there's been a lot of controversy around the way that we execute the gas tax swap from 2010, which is, for the uninitiated, it involves a calculation done by the Board of Equalization each year, and then a move up or a move down on the excise tax level, depending on what the estimated sales tax would have been when we had a sales tax on gas. So it's a complicated process, but it's really unsatisfying for virtually everybody in the transportation industry. Some years it goes up and nobody likes when it goes up, and some years when it goes down and nobody likes when it goes down, and it makes it a little bit volatile and difficult to plan projects against. I think one of the things in the presentation shows that the STIP dollars are something like $308 million or something for the year. That's in part because the move down this year was significant because gas prices dropped a lot in the last budget year. We think it may be worthwhile to visit that process again and figure out, particularly in a time where we're not looking for revenue neutrality necessarily in transportation, but new dedicated source, maybe looking at whether or not that's a smart process, and maybe whether or not we ought to perhaps index whatever our flat rate is so that it grows with inflation. That way you got a growing source that can meet always increasing demand. So those are a couple areas where I would suggest that maybe need some review that weren't specifically referenced, I think, in the presentation, but I would point to those, Mr.
So
Chairman.
running the agency, you think chaos in the revenues leads to chaos in the project delivery? That's a general statement, but I think it creates.
Yes. Well, I would certainly say that.
If you don't really know what kind of revenues you're going to have.
Certainly chaos in the revenue
You
causes.
can't really plan
Yeah.
projects.
Chaos in the revenues cause chaos in the programming, no question about it.
I think that's something we ought to really, that's why I'd like to see a stable, ongoing source, stability. And
I mean, I think one of the keys to that, Mr. Chairman, that I'm just compelled to say is that I think it's one of the key reasons that we got to get out of the general fund dialogue on transportation.
Right.
And I say that because,
general fund-
you know, in part, some of the ways we've gone to fund transportation in the last, decade and a half has been using what has been historic general fund resources. And then when we have bad economic times and bad fiscal times, we're quick to go to those same resources for the fix on our fiscal problem. And all we get out of that in the transportation world is volatility. So I want to, commend you and say that you've started with a bill that says we ought to get out of that dynamic and we got to get to transportation user fees, and we agree.
Yeah, that user fee approach is relative to just talking about user fees. I think we need to talk about what's fair and making sure that everybody pays their fair share. I think I've been saying that all along, that pay their fair share. And I kind of think of myself and my mom, for my committee. It's kind of how I think. I think mom's in her 80s and she drives maybe once or twice a week. She probably puts on, I don't know if she puts 1,000 miles on her car. She's very proud she's able to drive, but she drives to church, she drives to the store. When once in a while, some other trips with the family. Of course, she has a battalion of members of the family because we have, you know, she has 10 children, so there's, and grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So she has a whole battalion of people that can drive her wherever she wants. But she likes the fact that she's able to drive. Why should mom pay the same fee as her son Jim, who drives to Sacramento and back, puts on, you know, I'm kind of a 23,000, 25,000 miles a year. Why should mom pay the same fee as me? And I kind of, there's a lot of moms out there and other people that drive only like the 1,000 miles at most that my mom drives. I'm kind of, I think equity and making sure everybody pays their fair share is important, and that we don't burden some of those that really aren't really using the road system as much, especially our retirees and our seniors that are not really using the road system as much as the rest of us are. So I think there's some equity there.
Might be a good transition to Mr. Madaver.
Yeah. Well, that's the key in finding out the mix of how you put this together. But I think for me, I'm looking at that as kind of a guiding light, you know, in terms of how I approach things. My grandmother had her driver's license till she was 94. So I think my mom's going to be driving for a while. So let's move to let's move to some of our next panelists, you know, I really want to say that the great work that the California Association of Counties has done with the League of Cities as partners in preparing all these background materials. So I'm going to turn it over to the president of the counties, Vito Chiesa. Vito, you have the floor, and you've done some great job works on all these issues with your staff, working with us on this issue. So I'll turn it over to you for your perspective as president of the California Association of Counties.
Well, thank you, and let me be the first to offer up good afternoon, Mr. Chair and fellow committee members. My name is Vito Chiesa. I am a Stanislaus County Supervisor, and I'm currently serving as President of the California State Association of Counties. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important hearing. I'm very pleased to be here today on behalf of both CSAC and the League of California Cities to provide a local government perspective on statewide transportation funding solutions. Before I get going, I wanted to acknowledge something that Secretary Kelly had said. I couldn't agree with him more when he was talking about partnership, and it will take a comprehensive solution to fix this. I also agree that I need to pass on to the governor, thanking him for holding a special session on transportation, something that's so important for us. As you heard during the first panel, local governments and our partners have done exhaustive research in defining transportation funding needs. I'll remind you of the numbers that my colleague from San Jose provided you earlier this morning. Waiting just 5 years to invest in the local system adds $11 billion in unfunded needs and $21 billion over the next decade. It is clear we need to act soon to avoid higher costs to taxpayers. The problems are well known. The main reason is how we do make significant investments that will actually tackle these massive state and local shortfalls. In focus groups, voters have supported levying small revenue increases from multiple sources. The approach would promote fairness because everyone uses the transportation system differently. It would also avoid the sticker shock that would come from raising all of the revenue in one single source. Local governments agree with this logic, and CSAC and the League support a broad array of potential solutions similar to what's in Senator Bell's SB 16, including the increase in the diesel tax to compensate for the damage that heavy vehicles do to state and local roads, imposing vehicle registration fees and/or increasing the vehicle license fee with these new revenues dedicated to road and highway maintenance, imposing a fee to ensure that zero-emission vehicles contribute to road maintenance, an important consideration as the percentage of those vehicles in the overall fleet will continue to increase. More importantly, we support increasing the gasoline excise tax, which hasn't been adjusted in over 20 years. As you know, the average fuel economy of vehicles has increased, but the main reason the gas tax is worth less today is inflation and increases in construction cost. We should modernize our revenue options as electric and hybrid vehicles proliferate, but the gas tax is still the easiest way to quickly generate a significant amount of funding for roads and highways while we develop longer-term solutions. Vehicles vary in how much gas they use, but the gas tax serves as a relatively fair user fee. Those who drive more pay more. The way we use the new revenue is as important as the mechanisms we will use to raise it. Local governments support a fix-it-first approach. New funding should be overwhelmingly dedicated to maintenance. This is a proven approach that will reduce the cost of maintaining our transportation system over the long run. Voters also recognize that our existing facilities haven't been well maintained and support making maintenance a priority. New funding should also be shared equally between the state and local system. We have historically shared gas tax revenues between state and local transportation systems. Similarly, revenues generated at the local level are also shared and invested in the state highway system, local roads, and transit. This approach makes sense. People who pay the tax drive on both state and local facilities. They might not even know when they're traveling on a locally owned expressway or a state-owned surface road. People want a reliable roadway network that works for both local trips, including those taken on foot, bike, or transit, and long-distance or regional travel on state highways. We shouldn't reinvent the wheel in allocating basic maintenance money. Locals have historically received gas and sales tax revenues through direct subventions. Transparency and accountability for the use of new funding is warranted. Counties and cities adopt project lists at public hearings and provide extensive reports to the State Controller's Office regarding all revenues and expenditures. Nor should we forget the pavement management systems counties and cities use to make sure maintenance dollars are spent in the most effective way. Accordingly, local governments support accountability measures like the reports required for Proposition 1B, which will inform the public without imposing excessive administrative costs and project delays. Finally, we keep the confidence of voters. We must ensure that new revenues are dedicated to transportation uses. Voters have supported this approach time and time again, and any actions taken this year must continue to keep those promises. Cities and counties have the ability to quickly put hundreds of millions of dollars to work immediately on important maintenance and safety projects on the local system. We recognize the challenge of tackling the entire shortfall of nearly $8 billion, but with an investment of $3 billion a year over the next 10 years, we can make significant strides. $3 billion a year directed to cities and counties would bring roads into a good condition with a C grade. Without the investment, roads fall into the F grade. The funding shortfall grows by $21 billion, and a quarter of our roads will fall into the failed category. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. CSAC and the League are ready to partner with you on these important issues and help you tackle. I wanted to say one comment because we earlier talked about self-help counties, and there's 20 self-help counties generating just short of $4 billion a year. The next 15 that are identified in Stanislaus County is one of them. We're considered aspiring counties, would generate about $300 million annually. So the hugest benefit, or the greatest benefit, is there. But Stanislaus County is going in 2016, November of 2016. It is a part of the funding solution. It is not the cure-all. We still need other revenue sources. And going back to SB 16, Senator Bell's bill, there's a 5% set aside as incentive. I think it's a great opportunity. I've been talking to people around the state who are in the aspiring category. Of course, they think it's fantastic as an incentive. And I look forward to, again, CSAC, on behalf of CSAC and the League of Cities, working with all of you to make this a success.
That's a different idea that nobody's ever put out there, but I thought, why not try to incentivize some of these aspiring counties to pass these sales taxes? Because that would be more of an incentive, and you think it would help the voters make their decision? I
do, and as we talked about the fiscal cliff of Prop 1B when they ran out of matching money, and you're talking about leveraging is a huge sales point to the folks. Here's a pot of money that can be leveraged directly by these aspiring counties. And I think it'll be great. I've talked to all my cities about it. Everyone thinks it's a great idea. And keeping it in the bill will be paramount for myself personally.